Welcome to Lost Scribe Media, presented by Bosky Beard Oil. We are here today with Floyd Davis. He has been a longtime community activist in the city of Chicago. How you doing today, Brother Floyd?
Good. How are you today, Brother Naveed?
Alhamdulillah. Thank you. All praise due to God. I wanted to, give the viewers an opportunity to dig into your life story and all the experiences that you've had and the things that you've seen and how your understanding of the universe and life has grown and developed over time. So just give us a little bit of the history, growing up and in Chicago and the kind of things you saw and just that story.
Okay. Well, my life story is too much different from the majority of young African-American men that grew up in the 60s and early 70s in Chicago. We're the products of generational poverty. We're the products of seeing our parents and grandparents mistreated by a system that perpetuates this poverty. And during the 60s, you saw a lot of young African-American men in the community organized in bands and groups across the city. In the beginning, we were identified as youth groups, but the powers that be started to criminalize these groups and started calling them gangs. But you must understand, like, I was a member of the BlackStone Rangers. It was led by Imam Malik.
Can you give us a little bit of I don't mean to interrupt you, but I wanted to get a little bit of history of the Blackstone so people understand what we're talking about.
Okay. Well, the BlackStone Rangers originated in the Woodlawn community in 1959 in the city of Chicago. And they were formed to protect the youngsters from the bullies and the peddlers or purveyors of crime in the area. As we organized and continually spread throughout the city, there were thousands of members. By 1967, 68, there were at least 10,000 members throughout the city of Chicago. Black historian Timmy Black actually said we were the first youth Black nationalist movement in the United States. We worked with Dr. King when he came to Chicago in 1966 for the Fair Housing Peace, and he spoke of us in the formation of the Poor People's Campaign when he initiated that press conference on December the 4th of 1968, actually 4 months before he was assassinated. And what we did was patrolled our communities. We kept the dope peddlers out of the communities. We protected the women. And at that point, we became a political force. In 1968, Jeff Fort was invited to the White House by President Richard Nixon because of our no vote campaign in the city of Chicago, which kept the Democratic vote, which is passed down in our community like a family heirloom. Everybody born a Democrat. So, we kind of put a freeze on that block, and it was recognized by the President of the United States, which invited Jeff to the inauguration. He didn't go personally, but he sent two representatives. He had too much work to do here in the city.
I see.
But our community and our organization did a lot of good work here. I mean, we weren't a subversive underground group. One of the biggest events in the city of Chicago in the African-American community is the Bud Billiken Parade. And we had floats in the parade. We worked with Sammy Davis Jr. We worked with Oscar Brown Jr. in 1966. Oscar Brown Jr., who was a Black playwright and musician, he organized a group within our organization and presented a play that went across the country called Opportunity Please Not, where we highlighted our artistic abilities in singing and things of that nature. This show went on to be produced and performed on national TV. At that point, again, like I say, we began to be a political force within our community, which is a danger to the Democratic machine here in Chicago because of their history.
Yeah.
A lot of people don't understand that the Democratic machine that we see today, the remnants of it anyway, were formed by Richard Daley and the Dunns and the Danahers back in the early 1900s. They started out as a so-called youth gang called the Hamburgers out of Bridgeport. As a matter of fact, they played a large role in the race riot of, I believe it was 1919, on the 31st Street beach, where a young African-American was beaten to death because of crossing a boundary in the water. But Daley was the president of this hamburger group. As they grew older and the Irish politicians saw that they were growing and spreading out in their community, they pulled them in. They put their arms around the hamburgers and they became the Hamburg Social Club. But their job and their mission was the same as ours, to empower our community. And there was a very well-known journalist here in Chicago, Mike Royko. He wrote a book called Boss. And in the book, he stated that the reason why the Democratic machine and Mayor Daley decided to declare war on the so-called BlackStone Rangers was because of those same political ambitions. They saw the same thing being created in our community that was created in their community. But what you look at is you have to deal with the issue of racism. Those young Irish thugs were pulled into a system where they could become the police, the firemen, and different city workers in different positions, and they kind of like cleaned them up. Well, we didn't have that in
on
our
the
community.
surface.
On the surface, absolutely.
Right.
But we didn't have that in our community. You know, racism still kept us out of different positions because our black political machine wasn't strong enough at that time anyway. African American community really started out as strong Republican voters because of the work of Abraham Lincoln, who was a Republican. But in Chicago in the early 1950s is when Congressman Bill Dawson, who was associated with the first Daley, turned the black community over to a Democratic machine. And I feel it's been to our detriment ever since.
Absolutely, I agree with that. I don't want to interrupt you, but I wanted to get a little point across right there with that. How specifically did they do that? Because we know, for example, from colonial periods, where like in India, where we had Christian preachers who would, preach the gospel and prosperity and et cetera, give food and give aid, and then they convinced a lot of, native Indians, Hindus, et cetera, to become Christian. Absolutely. So similarly, I'm sure there was a process, but what were the kind of key points of that process to turn all those people into intergenerationally, Democrat voters?
Well, as you say, the machine, or the system, however you want to say it, they always have used the African American preachers, excuse me, as a force within our community. They empower them. I can go back as far as in the early 1900s. 1927, I believe it was, if I'm not mistaken, you had a large Moorish American community being formed here in the south side of Chicago under Prophet Noble Drew Ali. And during this same period, you had about 10,000 Moors that was in the city of Chicago. The Rockefeller Foundation donated $2 million to the the Christian Baptist National Baptist Institute, which had a church located on 31st and King Drive. It's still there today. But the Rockefeller Foundation donated $2 million, 1920s money, to build churches and to try to stop or put a block on the building the spread of Islam, which was spreading in our community. So you have to understand that it's the same thing that they did back after the Civil War, when the government sat down and promised the old famous or infamous 40 acres and a mule.
Right.
They sat down and dealt with the preachers and the clergy. And the clergy...
And they were the intermediaries between the people.
Between the people, and we lost out again. So it's a long history of the Christian ministers being a part of the destruction of our community. Even today, like we say, we can start at the 20s, we can come down through the 40s, the 50s, the 60s. During our time, we saw the same thing with the Woodlawn organization that was run by Bishop Brazier and Leon Finney. And they mismanaged the funds, they misused the funds, but because we were already criminalized as a youth gang, well, Jeff Ford took the fall, and 4 other members, for embezzling funds that they didn't have direct control of. Okay, so but it's easier to sell that story when the people's mind are already convinced that you're the bad guys. And the media plays a great role in criminalizing our kids. Even today, we see where they're locking up or putting handcuffs on 5- and 6-year-old kids in schools. I was watching a program the other day. They charged a young African American kid petty larceny for taking a carton of milk in a lunchroom in a school. So, these are the things that are not propagated fully in our community to understand that this is a very, very, very diabolical plan that's been in existence since time immemorial in this country as far as we're concerned. But again, let's let that digress. The
so we're at the
Foundation
40s,
put that
50s,
money in there, and that would slow down the movement of the 20s and 30s. And then in the 60s, we saw the same thing again. Okay, Dr. King came to Chicago, and he acknowledged who we were and our work we were doing in the community, and he wanted us to be a part of the movement. We became a part of that movement. After Dr. King was assassinated, we saw that his group splintered, and then you saw people like Andy Young and Jesse Jackson and other part that was at the inner circle. You saw them getting in positions of prominence in the community. But the last program that Dr. King initiated after the Civil Rights Bill and all those things were enacted was the Poor People's Campaign. This was a campaign that he was focusing on the economics, not just of blacks, but poor, white, Hispanic, European, whatever, everybody. There's more poor people in this country.
I feel like that's another thing that we still haven't got to that point yet, because these people in the Democrat machine, like you said, is still pumping that race idea when it's really socioeconomic.
There you go.
And and then that's why at the very top you see all races enjoying themselves and enjoying either the fruits of their labor or the fruits of their exploitation all together.
That's right.
And the poor people are convinced that they are actually fighting other poor people of different racial backgrounds.
I mean, just look at the situation today. He played to the darker angels and natures of men. This is Donald Trump I'm speaking of. And racism is really ignorance. It's one of the deepest parts of ignorance I can see, this racism, because when you can play to the lower nature of man, what they call it, demagogues, then they will respond in ways that they even vote against their own self-interest. And you saw Donald Trump speak about anti-Hispanics, anti-black, anti-immigrants, anti-Muslim, anti-everything, reaching for a core base of racists in this country, which once they put him in power, one of the first things he enacted was to destroy the funding that was going into the communities that needed him. Now you see the town hall meetings across the country where the Republicans, the white Republicans, are coming out and they're screaming at their congressmen, they're screaming at their representatives, because they're saying now, well, wait a minute. We weren't the ones that were intended to be hurt. We thought you were only going to hurt them. But you see how voting based on that racist theory, it destroyed them. It's hurting them. And now we've got a president that's the laughingstock of the world, who's, this is like the Twilight Zone. We were talking now with a president that they say has ties so close with the Russian government. I mean, this is almost treasonous, but...
well, that's if the Jewish media finally is telling the truth.
Yeah, absolutely, because
right?
Again, the media is
because if we're going to say what the media says, then we might as well be proxies of the Jews, because that's what a lot of our communities have served as. And that's what, irrespective of what he is trying to do, in my personal opinion, one of the things that's the problem that's occurring now is that the Muslims are getting behind Jewish organizations, right? And if you look at the Civil Rights era, if you look at the NAACP, you look at all of these organizations, a lot of these organizations were created by Jews or with Jewish funding, right? From the very beginning. And as you and I, I'm sure both know, Jews were overwhelmingly represented in the owners of the slave ships that brought slaves to, over here. And also they created a religious justification called the Curse of Ham, right? As The Nation has written about. And The Nation has, I think, got 2 books on it. It's called The Secret Relationship Between Blacks and Jews, Volume 1, and then Volume 2. And I think they have a Volume 3 now, which is a story about a Jewish Freemason named Leo Frank, who raped a young white girl and then killed her, or strangled her, I believe, 13-year-old, and he tried to blame it on a black man that had been working at that time. And what happened was that although there was a very big climate of racism and Jews were able to escape that because they appeared white, that's another distinction that I feel like a lot of the people of color don't make, is the difference between whites and Jews as it relates to especially Christianity versus Judaism. But in any case, they did try to, he tried to get them to lynch the black man as opposed to himself and blame him, but they knew better at that time, even in that climate, and they ended up hanging him, and he had to, and then that's what created the ADL, which is the Jewish Freemasonic B'nai B'rith group that is like the one who, browbeats everyone if they, step out of line in terms of discrimination, especially against Jews, anti-Semitism, etc. So I find it a little problematic when the Muslims now, instead of organizing themselves and saying, hey, we are our own leaders. It doesn't matter, if all the different Muslim communities, we all have slightly different ideological kind of leanings. But one thing I've noticed is that now they're just kind of putting their weight behind these Jewish groups who have been established for a very long period of time, and they have a different notion in mind. In the Quran, as we're both Muslim, it tells us that they are the ones who create war and division between people. Right. So if we look at how divided our society is right now, and then how the people think that they're going to reconcile a division, you see, so there's this thing, and then you see these people swimming right in the middle, right, and they get to not be white, and they get to be a minority.
Right.
Whereas, when people talk about white privilege, there's no such thing as white privilege compared to Jew privilege. The Jewish privilege is the most toxic and overwhelming privilege that there is in this country, because they get to be a minority, they get to be above reproach, they get to articulate the visions of all the different people, they get to silence people who don't agree with them, and things like that. So I view the presidency in a little bit of a different light as a result of that, because for example, President Trump, he said to the Jews, you guys want to control your puppets, and you control your politicians like puppets, and I don't want to take your money because I'm not going to be a puppet of anyone. You see, so that to me was one thing that separated him from pretty much our entire political history. Because JFK was the last president that we believe Israel killed, and there's a lot of research that kind of yields that conclusion. But even he took money from them. He worked with the mob. He worked with Meyer Lansky, and he had a lot of personal improprieties, I would say. Like he was a womanizer. He couldn't keep that to himself. He had to do that. So as a result, they had a lot of dirt on him anyway. So this political climate in this era, in this time, it's pretty much unprecedented. And I feel like as individuals, like yourself and myself and other people who are activists in the community, we have a greater opportunity right now to shine a light on certain things that we haven't had the opportunity to do so, just because of the hysteria and the climate and people not knowing what's really happening. Absolutely. So but going back to how the Democrats kind of took over, this is an important subject that a lot of people don't understand. I was in a community organization group about a week ago, last Wednesday, I believe it was, and I ended up, getting on TV because there was a protest and everything like that. But when I walked in and let them know that, I was protesting the protesters in a sense, or I was talking against them, they just threw their hands up like, wow, this guy's crazy. And I'm sitting there thinking, like, I'm here with you. I'm here I'm not getting paid for this. I mean, I'm coming here to help, and I'm very much willing and desirous of changing the conditions and ameliorating conditions in this community. So why would you assume that if I support someone, or I support someone, protecting someone, or defending someone against opposition, that I'm not with you, and it's because of the brainwashing that the Democrats have done, where it's like a plantation. Absolutely. It's like if you stray from the plantation, something calls you right back.
Yeah, that's right.
And it's and whether it's racism or bigotry or whatever the word catchphrase is. But in my opinion, based on subsequent events from the 1960s to now, if you look at my opinion now, of course, because I'm not African American, but if I look at the African American, in my opinion, objectively, the circumstances that they're living in, generally speaking, obviously there's people, there's a lot of really wealthy African Americans,
but in the general sense,
the general sense
of our community is living in generational poverty.
Right, and it's reinforced and reinforced and reinforced. And the problem, one of the biggest problems is that the community now is relying on the government, as opposed to relying on itself as it did before the civil rights era. Right. Because the community was working together. They didn't need to be patrons of white businesses, because they could be patrons of their own businesses and keep the money in the community. And if you look at the economics, which is a focus of both of ours, that is where a lot of that got shifted, because the issue became, no, it's about your race and these white people not letting you in their business, as opposed to, hey, if that's the case, let them do their thing. That's better. Let's separate. And Malcolm talked about this. What's interesting
is before Malcolm, I'm gonna go back again to the early 20s in Chicago when we talk about Noble Drew Ali and the Moore Sands Temple of America. Jesse Benga along 37th Street and State Street on the South Side in Bronzeville, what they call Bronzeville today. There was an economic engine. He owned his own bank. There were businesses that were flourishing in the 20s and 30s. The music was owned, and it was just like hip hop. Later on, it became a cultural thing. But Oscar DePriest, he was the first African American elected to the Congress with the support of Noble Drew and the Moore Sands Timber of America back in 1928.
Oh, wow.
And they were Republicans.
Yeah.
Now, here's a chain for that second ward, that congressional district, because they gerrymandered so much now and they changed the lines and boundaries and stuff.
Yeah, yeah.
But there was a line of continuity. You had Oscar DePriest. You had his protege was William Dawson. Under William Dawson, then came Alderman Barnett. Then after Barnett came Bobby Rush. And that line stayed in place until the lines got to blur it, and then you got Fioretti, who was an Italian, elected to that ward. But if we had stuck to the principles that put us in the power in the first place, then we would have maintained that same control. But when the move was made by Bill Dawson in the 50s to join forces with the Democratic Party, it became a real bad situation for us. You use the term back on the plantation. That's what came about. We came back on that plantation politically, because as I said earlier, we passed down in our community the Democratic vote like it's a family heirloom. You're born a Democrat. Your kids are going to be a Democrat. And when they know this, when that system recognizes that, then they don't have to give you what you need because they already got your support. As opposed to if we used our community like everybody else does, you know, whose interests
what are you going to do for us?
Aligned with ours.
Yeah.
You know, some could be Democrat, some could be Republican. But if you counted on all to be a Democrat, then why would the Republicans want to put anything there?
Right.
Democrats are not going to put anything there because they already know they got your vote.
Yeah.
That was the importance of the move that Jeff Fort made in 1967, 68 with the don't vote.
Mm-hmm.
Don't give your vote away.
Right.
Nixon responded, hey, we got something going on here in Cook County in Chicago, okay? And that's when the Democratic machine said we got to declare war on the BlackStone Rangers, knowing his history with the hamburgers. Wow, if those guys can do the same thing we can do, they can control the black community. If they're already trying to land up with the Republicans, we're through. People don't look at it like that. They look at the news, oh, the BlackStone Rangers was indicted for this, indicted for that. In the 60s, they had a lot of arson in the Woodlawn community, the community where we were at. They said we were burning down all the buildings. Well, people believe that. But how much sense, when you really think about it, I mean, are people going to go and burn down their own homes? Even after Dr. King's assassination, the south side of Chicago was the only section of the city that didn't go up in flames. Why? Because Jeff Ford walked through the streets and said, don't burn up your community.
Right.
Why are you going to burn up your own community?
Right.
Okay? And after that, it led, again, like I say, to political empowerment and the attack from the Democratic machine. Now today, our community is all in disarray. It's all about a land grab. It's all about taking the land back, passing out Section 8s, getting people out of the community, which takes you off the voter rolls and takes more and more power from you. So now we're sitting in a position now where we've got a mayor who could care less about what's happening in our community as opposed to currying to the developers, which are going to come in and buy up the land.
Yep.
They're going to build new housing.
They're already doing it.
You can't afford to come back into these communities. And a few years down the line, they'll say, well, budget cuts forcing us to eliminate so many Section 8 vouchers. And now you're going to have another pocket of poverty, and wherever the people from our city went. Also, with that destruction of the housing in Chicago, it led to a lot of the violence that's in the city of Chicago, because it tore down certain housing projects. They gave these housing vouchers to the families, and then they used these vouchers to go into communities where they had no relations, no community ties, and with the mindset that they had from the criminal activity they was doing, it automatically put them at war with the people that were there all the time. This is why the violence is so high. They know that. You don't have to be a rocket scientist to figure this out, okay? But this is something that's by design. This is not by accident. Every community that exploded in violence, today there's major development. When they come back and say affordable housing, well, affordable for who? If the house is going for $150,000, $180,000, well, it's not affordable to the people that's there. And the small print on the 5-year Chicago housing plan that was initiated roughly 3 years ago was to build low-income housing, but you have to have a median income of $90,000 to get back in these houses. Well, there are 2 family households in our community not making $90,000 a year. So who are they building them for? Who are they building them for? So this is a process that we've seen over and over and over again. And we keep falling into the same trap by saying, well, I support the democratic machine. If we could just step back for a minute, organize the community, register those young voters, and then use that vote as a tool to empower your community as opposed to not voting and let people just constantly direct your path. It's a vicious cycle that's been going on for years. How do you break it? We're trying to wake up the people. We're trying to get everybody to understand the power of that voter's registration card and then using it. Because if we don't, the next generation will be worse off than this generation.
That's true, and it's getting worse.
Yeah.
What do you think as far as you think is more important to participate in national elections or local?
Well, all politics are local.
Yeah.
I mean, we can participate in you're going to naturally participate in national election, but the greatest influence you have is right here in your own community.
That's right.
We've got a city council based of 50 aldermen. I think the Black Caucus is 18, 19, 20 aldermen. But if they're closely aligned with the machine that's got its foot on your neck, then how can they help us? They're voting against their own community today. At this very moment, they're signing and agreeing and doing a rubber stamp for plans and agreements and housing development. For example, there's more shooting and violence in our community on the south side of Chicago and the west side. But we didn't have a trauma center. It's not even a trauma center.
Yeah.
Okay? So, and as I look today, I saw about, 2-3 weeks ago, they said, well, we're going to change the law now so that kids as young as 16 and 17 can donate their organs on their own. They can sign it on the back of the driving license or sign the paper, whatever it is, and you can donate your organs, all right? But if the parent wants to come in and stop it, they can. All right, well, they've created a business off of the death and the misery in our community. They want to harvest those organs. Yesterday, the city of Chicago just signed another plan. They say that Chicago now is the hub for transplants. But we miss all that.
This has everything to do with the mayor, by the way, because let me tell you something. As far as this organ theft, and they've done this everywhere. They do this in Palestine. Yeah. They do this in Haiti with that earthquake.
Right.
It was big time organ theft. The Israelis came in and acted like they were going to be there to help, and they used to take people's eyeballs, their kidneys, their hearts, all different types of stuff, and transport it. This is a big business.
Big business.
And rabbis were caught in New Jersey stealing, like thousands of kidneys. And sometimes they'll like obviously it's more convenient if somebody comes to the hospital because of gang warfare, right, because nobody gives a damn about that person. And if you've already signed off on it, it's maybe even a greater likelihood that you end up passing away.
Let them die. We need that kidney.
Right. Because it's $100,000. Otherwise, why are you trying to help this guy anyway? Unless you got some great noble heart that you really care that much. And a lot of these people get in those positions because they don't care like that. That's what it is.
Absolutely.
And so I feel like if that's happening in Chicago, and it's a unique case in Chicago, it almost guaranteed has something to do with Rahm Emanuel. Because Rahm Emanuel, as we know from a political angle, is the highest level Mossad agent in the United States. Mm-hmm. Mossad is the Israeli CIA.
Correct.
And not to segue into anything else, but the next 9/11, because before 9/11 they put Jews in Hollywood and other places, they put little indications that this was going to happen in movies and things like that for decades. So this is how long they planned it. They've been doing that again in Chicago. over and over and over. Movies are showing post-apocalyptic Chicago with destructions of the buildings and things like that. If that happens, this guy did it because he has the connections throughout the globe, especially through the Mossad, that would facilitate it, then cover it up, blame somebody else, and try to get us into a new war. And that's really the goal of it. And by the way, obviously, if you shut down the city by blowing up half of it or blowing up a big chunk of downtown or something like that, what's going to happen to all that warfare that's happening in Inglewood and other places in the city is just going to definitely bleed over into those other areas.
Absolutely.
And it's interesting. Millionaires have been leaving by the thousands from Chicago.
Yeah.
So
losing every year.
Yeah. So it's a dark cloud almost. It's like kind of hanging over us, and I would not feel safe until this man leaves.
Well, like I say, you've got to, just that one issue we talked about with the organ transplant. It's not by accident, that they say, well, hey, we're going to lower the age so we can get permission from the kids themselves to donate their organs. And then a month later, hey, Chicago has become the hub for transplants. That's not by accident. That's by design. And if we continue to look at things as isolated events, then we'll never see the pattern that's being put in place for the destruction of our community. And I think one of the greatest things that our community can do is to form associations with Muslim communities. So because we're all being targeted in this country. But a lot of people don't even understand that the United States government, the first nation that even recognized the 13 colonies as a legitimate government, was an Islamic country, the government of Morocco. That was the first treaty that was signed by the United States government between King Muhammad V and George Washington, late 1700s. Before that, no other country would recognize the 13 colonies as a legitimate government because Great Britain was the world power. Nobody wanted to go against Great Britain.
Right.
The United States was considered outlaws, the rebels,
Right.
the revolutionaries.
Right.
But it was an Islamic country that gave them their legitimacy. We don't know that. So today we see the United States government taking the position of, well, Muslims are the bad guys. But there's a debt that's owed to the Islamic community. When we came over here on those slave ships, the majority of those people that came over were Muslim.
That's right.
When you talk about Columbus sailing from Spain to look for the New World, what they don't realize that Pedro Alonso Nino was a Moor who changed his name and dropped his Islamic religion to stay in the graces of the Spanish. But he was the navigator on the ship that showed Columbus how to get over here. Because you remember, they thought the world was flat. Go through the horizon, you drop off.
And they're trying to resurrect that idea but right now, actually, a lot of people online are telling people that the world is flat. And before that, Mansa Musa, they said, came here.
That's right.
And, established relations with the natives.
That's
intermarried with the natives. There's a tribe called the tribe of Ben Ishmael. That was like it had Irish, it had African people from African descent, and natives as well, and they all intermixed and had their own group. And there was a lot of Muslim relics that were left behind. And this is in the 1300s. Right. You see, so the idea that they discovered this savage land and then civilized the people and established everything, it's a mythology. The only thing I will say though is that because the Democrats use these ideas for their to reinforce the plantation mentality, what they have done is convince people, well, this country shouldn't have borders, and this country shouldn't have this and that, and everybody should be able to come here, and it should be a sanctuary for everybody and criminals and everything like that, just because back in the day, about 400 or 500 years ago, Europeans came and wiped out the natives. Right. But it's like you can't go back and change that history, but we all are still living here collectively, and we all have a right to live. We have a right to be safe and to be secure and have an opportunity for growth and economic development in our communities, etc. So it's a simple way to kind of wipe out all of that and just be like, oh well, they stole the land, so now everybody should just come here and Right. But that creates a lack of national unity and lack of cohesiveness. People would think, oh well, the so-called illegal immigrants and African Americans are just natural allies, but they're not, because if you're looking at if you're coming to anything with an exploitative mentality, you know, and in fact, you're committing a criminal act in a sense to even get here, right? And you're doing it for that reason, then, you know, the resources that you're taking away, or the additional crime and drugs that you're putting into those communities. I mean, where are the crime and the drugs going to go? But the cities, right? So it's a complicated mess that they have successfully created a false unity amongst all of these people that's just based on like either, hey, we're all minorities or whatever. But, you know, as we know, when the system tries to destroy us, it doesn't use their face, it uses our face.
Exactly.
You know,
Exactly.
and I'll give you an example. Obama, in 2009, I mean, obviously he campaigned on hope and change. And by the way, I mean, he was surrounded by a gaggle of Jews. They're the ones who elevated him to his position of power. If you look at what he did beforehand, he was using Alinsky tactics to organize the community. And, you know, Obama specifically in 1992, way before he probably even thought that he could ever be president of the United States, Betty Lou Saltzman, who is a billionaire Jewish woman, said that he was going to be our first president of the United States.
Well, they set the stage for it. Way back in those days, you had the professor over at the University of Illinois, who was at Ayers.
Yeah, Bill Ayers. Yeah,
Bill Ayers.
Yeah, he's still in Hyde Park right now.
Yeah, Bill Ayers.
Bernadine
wrote out a
Doran.
proposal for I believe it was $50 million to the Annenberg Foundation. The Annenberg Foundation sent that money back to Bill Ayers, and the community activist Barack Obama was the one that was in charge of dispensing this $50 million around the country to seed upcoming groups, or to start upcoming groups. So when it came time for him to run for president, everybody, well, how did he get the votes out of Nebraska and Oklahoma? It wasn't because of what he was saying. It was because of what he had done in the past. He passed this money out. So he had bases already established to come back to. But just that fact of that Annenberg money, just like we spoke of that Rockefeller money back in the 20s, to go to the Christian churches to try to stem the flow of Islam in the early 1900s. There's always money that's thrown out. And when you're dealing with an impoverished people that's being fed by the Christian ministers who line their pockets and they don't feed the flock.
That's right.
Then the results are going to be the same. And we see that same system from the time of the 40 acres and a mule right now today.
Yeah.
We got to use the preachers, because our people are spiritual people. They're people that's naturally spiritual, but they don't understand the truth. So now they're fed this falsehood, and then they're fed a chicken with it. And we fall off into this system where, well, the good preacher's going to take care of us. But the good preacher ain't taking care of you.
Well, that's why religion is such a potent force.
Absolutely.
For good and evil. You know,
That's
it can be used very, very much for good, and you see so many righteous people, you know, selflessly sacrifice themselves for the cause of the community or for the cause of the greater good. I mean, we've got in all of our communities tens of thousands of martyrs in history, right? Sure. And then on the other hand, you also have people who, you know, use the word of God, or, you know, and then you know, they get everybody riled up, and now you associate them with divinity and saintliness and things like that, and they exploit you. I mean, think about all the different preachers like T.D. Jakes and such, you know, who become millionaires, and they're preaching this gospel of so-called prosperity, but really it's prosperity for them, not prosperity for the flock at all. You know, and by the way, one of the things that I've learned over the last, say, 3 to 4 years is that the economic system, it's actually level playing field in a lot of ways, in the sense of if you have the knowledge of how the system operates. If you have that knowledge. But they purposely keep you from that knowledge. So we go to school, we don't learn none of that in middle school, elementary school, high school. I went to school in Kentucky, unfortunately. It was the 50 out of 50 states in terms of worst education. So when I left there, that's why you see a lot of books in this room, is because I felt very like uninformed and miseducated in a lot of ways. And obviously the school structure, the way it's built, it's not built for people who have creative minds and think, like, you know, on their own and things like that, because it's so regimented, it's so structured, and that's not how we naturally learn.
They indoctrinate us.
Yeah, exactly. Brainwashing.
Through the hoop. There's a difference between being indoctrinated and being educated.
Right.
And our people are being indoctrinated and have been indoctrinated with a system that is designed to keep us down.
That's right.
When we look at the early 1900s all the way up to the 60s in Chicago with the housing covenants, you know, we had a situation where the community was expanding, but we were forced to stay within these boundaries. And the rich Jewish landowners and real estate owners said, well, you know, how do we deal with this? Or the politicians asked the question, how do we deal with this? They're constantly expanding. They said, well, what we're going to do is cut up these houses and make smaller rooms. It's a boarding house. This is this. You share a bathroom. You do all that. But we got to keep them contained within this community. But the force that was paying the lawyers to fight to keep these restricted covenants in place was the University of Chicago. People don't understand that the University of Chicago has always been a wolf in sheep's clothing for our community. Yep. You know, the University of Chicago named the neighborhoods in Chicago. These 77, Inglewood, Roseman, they were named and designed by the University of Chicago. The University of Chicago played a great role in our generation in the destruction of the community by starting these fires and hiring people to come in and burn these communities down. But who ended up owning the property? The University of Chicago.
That's right.
Okay.
That's right.
Who has the biggest church sitting over there in the Woodlawn community? Bishop Brazier. But when you sit there on a Sunday and you watch the parishioners leave, those cars all leave out of the community. Those are not the people from the community.
No.
Okay. I had even heard that for years, you know, that Woodlawn community was a desert, you know, food desert they call it. No major food, grocery stores, fresh vegetables, fresh meat. But to my understanding, it was those very same people that forced that community to those conditions because they had a position that if we're not 50% owners in whatever comes in here, we're not going to go for it. So they watched their community suffer for years. And it's been a long line of politicians out of that, and aldermen out of that 20th ward. They'll get in with the support of
the people,
preachers and the TWO, and they'll go along so far, and then they're indicted. Because as soon as I guess their heart or their mind or whatever it is, say, man, wait a minute, this is not working for our people. And I came in originally, yeah, I'm looking out for me. But at some point, your conscience is going to get to working on you. And when it does, and when they try to go against that machine in our community, they're indicted. They're indicted. They're indicted. Same thing with the youth groups. You criminalize them, and you're indicted. You're indicted. You're indicted. But it's been a land grab. This land grab that we're looking at today, you've got what do they call it, a boat dock that was built on 31st and Lakeshore Drive. They changed that whole community over there. But how many boats are coming from the people that live in that community? Because a lot of people that live in that community can't even go there and enjoy the beach because now it's been like almost privatized. You know, when you look at what's going down in this city, it's not designed to help the community. Okay? Even on a national level, we're talking about green energy. Everybody's speaking about green energy, clean energy. All right? China has taken the lead in the production of solar panels. Okay? But the United States can build these factories to produce these solar panels in these impoverished communities around the country and take the lead on that. These Fortune 500 companies that are coming in, putting the Starbucks and the Whole Foods and the McDonald's in these impoverished communities, could come in not as sole owners, but as partners. They can set up co-ops, 50% ownership by the franchise, 50% owned by the community. But they will hurry up and tell you, well, we're going to open up XYZ and we're going to provide 100 jobs. Well, 100 jobs, minimum wage jobs, is not going to change the community. But if that company came in as a co-op, then 50% of those proceeds would go to the community to build smaller businesses where the money rotates around the community as opposed to all leaving out of the community. Now, it's a three-tiered attack. I mean, you got organizations, 501c3s that are looking for funding, all right? Well, let's get funding for those 501c3s to do the recruitment and the screening and the training of a workforce. Let's these co-ops begin so that ownership is split where the funding stays within the community. Let the government come in and build the factories so that we can produce the solar panels. It's an international market for them. I mean, there are parts of Africa, Asia, even America. Look at all the abandoned houses in Chicago. We've got 80,000 parcels of property that's just sitting. Well, why not start a program where, as we producing these solar panels, let's make these houses all rehab with that type of energy in mind. You know, everything is self-supporting.
Yeah.
But I'm not, if I can think of this, I know big businesses started this, but it's not to
politically it's not politically feasible.
There you go.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit more. So you brought us to the 60s, late 60s and stuff, and then that's kind of where through the civil rights era and, the organizing and things like that, they kind of co-opted the community and brought them all under the umbrella of the Democratic Party. How did you kind of develop in your personal understanding, seeing that and obviously being, a member of the community that was active and knew on the ground level what people needed, and then how Islam played a role in, maybe shaping your understanding or expanding it?
Okay. Well, before we get back, I'm going to say one more thing on unity in our community. In 1969, the so-called gangs in Chicago all came together. Vice Lords, the Stones, the Disciples, they all came together and said, man, look at all of this construction that's going on. But we're not benefiting from it. But if we all band together and shut down the construction, then it's going to force politicians and the trades to come to the table with us. And it was a successful operation. We shut down all the major construction in the city, south side, west side, north side, everywhere, okay? And we forced the building trades to force the politician, because money is the lifeblood of a political organization. If the building trades wasn't making money, they couldn't make the contribution to the politician. So they forced the politician to come to the table. And on January the 12th, 1970, there was an agreement signed between the city of Chicago, the building trades, the BlackStone Rangers, the Vice Lords, the Disciples, and the Reverends, the good Reverends were all part of this as well, to guarantee 4,000 immediate jobs for young African American men. And then a monthly number was established. So every month you can bring them into the unions so they could be qualified for these positions. Well, that was the first time that we had ever forced, in our community, had ever forced the mayor and the building trades to sit down and sign an agreement that would be positive for us. But just as that progress was being made, that's when the war was declared on the leadership of these organizations. The minds that were taken away were the minds that were setting the stage for the future.
Yeah.
Then the media force-fed us this gangsterism, Hell Up in Harlem, Superfly, and then they flooded our community with these drugs from New York to LA.
Yep.
And it played such a role that, we went from nationalism and combat boots, like I said earlier, to Superfly and platform shoes and everything.
And now, right now, you look at it and it's like the flamboyant homosexuality of the leadership and the transgender issue and things like that.
You see how they're trying to make it normal?
Beyond normal. They're trying to normalize pedophilia.
Everything. But they did the same thing with this young generation with hip-hop. Hip-hop started out as an East Coast phenomenon with teaching about culture and history, and the record companies stopped promoting the East Coast rap because it was talking too much about culture, and they started promoting the West Coast rap, the gangster rap. So you went from teaching about your culture to selling drugs and shooting guns on the younger generation, but didn't realize this was the same thing happened to the previous generation. And in the next 10 years, there'll be another same wave that'll come out to corrupt those minds. And we see all this violence, we see these kids shooting. They've been desocialized. They came up for the most part sitting in the house playing on the little TV video games, Grand Theft and all this stuff, and shooting people going up here. When they got old enough, they had to get out the house. But they're still kids in mind, they're babies in mind. And they come out on the street, they're scared, it's a new world to them. First thing I gotta do is get a gun. Now you bump into them, they wanna shoot you. We seeing 2-year-olds, 10-year-olds, 12-year-olds, 13-year-olds, gunned down by 17, 18, and 19-year-olds. And they get in jail, they have no education, they lost their future. The kids that they produce is the generation that's gonna come up after them. So where are they going to be at? At some point, we have to break the cycle, and this is the point that we try to say that the Islamic community is one of our last hopes, because if we can coordinate our efforts, because we're both being attacked, if we can join our efforts and bring resources into the community, educate our people, then we can form a new bloc. Because this minority word is a joke.
Yeah.
We're not minorities. We're not the minorities. And scientists, I'm not scientists, but what do they call them, statisticians and everything has already said in the next 20 years, this will be a majority of people of color in this country.
Yeah, it's already almost there.
Yeah, and that's why they fight so hard.
Yeah. But that's, again, it's kind of a double-edged sword, because that it almost means that we all have the exact same motivations in mind. But here's the problem with that, is that people are so ideologically bent sometimes on certain things. So, even though you would naturally be allies, given that, maybe in a similar way you're oppressed because of people's brainwashing and ideologies, sometimes you can't even get through to the people that would be your natural allies otherwise. So that's why, again, to a degree, it's like, you want to do well for your specific community, right?
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, sometimes individuals within that community will chop your legs off for their own interests.
Well, that's why I said we got to go back to where Dr. King left off. Dr. King wasn't focusing on a race issue. He was focusing on an economic issue. He said, poor people's campaign. See, as long as he talked civil rights, hell, no problem. But when he got to talking about that money, when he got to talking about equal distribution, Dr. King asked for $30 billion in 1960 money to create economic engines in the communities across the country, from the Appalachians to the inner cities. If you put together a program where you're bringing money into these communities on that level, like we spoke of with the green energy piece, then you can change these communities. You can change the mindset of people. But as long as we are all starving, and they feed you a few crumbs, and you take those crumbs and you fall in line. But if we all got that one mindset, hey, they speak of every day, the 1%ers, the 1% control of government. Well, I've never seen one be more than 99 if the 99 is all connected.
You actually don't even need all of the 99 to be connected. You could just get a small minority of the 99 connected, right?
But the trick is this. Let's keep the 99 powerless by keeping them out of the mechanism that run this country, which is called voting. If we keep them from registering to vote, if we keep them up under so much pressure with this poverty, and if we keep putting up these leaders that they think is their real leaders but are only puppets for the machine, that promise them everything and delivers on nothing. But then again, we're talking about people that's in the mindset of, I'm a Democrat like it's a family heirloom. There's got to be a whole restructuring of the political system. Within our country, we have to form new alliances.
Yeah.
We have to put together a program that's going to benefit the people, as opposed to voting for the guy who's got his picture on TV. Or the guy that you say, well, he's been around for 20 years. Okay, he's been in office for 20 years, but what has he changed in your community? You asked the question earlier, is national or local more important? To me, it's local. Because it's not the national agenda that can affect what goes on in your community as much as you controlling the politicians.
So bringing it back to Islam, how do you feel like, first of all, with your evolution and understanding through Islam, and also what Islam can maybe do as a ideology for people of color and different individuals who are maybe suffering politically, economically, socially? What would you say it can provide as a maybe a open-ended ideology in a sense?
Well, it can be a link to a more global way of thinking. Right now, again, we've been not force-fed, but we've been choosing this Christianity as a way of hope. And the ones that are propagating the faith in our community are not Christians in a true sense, if you talking about what Christianity stands for.
Yeah.
I mean, Jesus said, visit the prisoners, feed the poor, these type of things. But this is a system that Christians were their Christianity is the flag they held up the highest during slavery.
Yeah.
So this same mindset now is not going to help you. So we need to forge alliances. Like we said, we need to forge alliances with the Islamic communities. And that gives us a more global view, even in Africa. You're not just talking about the Arab community, in the African community. You got Muslims all over the world. There are things that we can do through Islam that we can't do in this system in America. And the first thing we got to understand is this country owes a debt to Islam.
Well, a lot of the Constitution is Islamic. I mean, that's another thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I've always wondered why they say Crispus Attucks, a black man, was the first man to die for the American Revolution. Why is that? What make this brother so important? Where did the money come from when George Washington, they tell you about crossing the Potomac and the men had to eat the shoe leather, and then they all of a sudden they got this great influx of funding? Where did it come from? But we know who signed the first friendship treaty, the government of Morocco. So there's a lot of things that needs to be investigated now to show the continuity from the beginning of where we came from.
Well, you know, in the 1700s, there was a statue of the Prophet Muhammad in, I think it was in Washington, D.C. or something, because he was a great lawgiver of history. Mm. So now you want to talk all the stuff that the Muslims are 1.6 billion savages. Yeah. But back in the day, I mean, the founding fathers, they had a great respect for Islam because they knew that, you know, this is an ideology that, you know, if you're a Christian or whoever, Mason or whatever they were, they knew that they would have to contend with it. And on top of that, they knew how cohesive it was, and they knew how it could revolutionize people's thinking. I mean, you know, the fact of what happened in Arabia with the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, it's not something they can hide. Right. It's not something that can be denied. So as a result, I mean, you know, in this modern era, we see, you know, the socioeconomic and political realities now being addressed as if they're religious, you know, like all the poverty in the Muslim world, and then now being bombed for about 15 years straight in a war on Islam that they call terror. And then you'll have a guy like Obama say, "Oh, we can't call it radical Islam," but you're actually creating it, and you're bombing them. So it's like a really interesting way to approach the whole scenario. So I would say that, yeah, again, I agree with you. I feel like Islam is very revolutionary in that sense. And one of the biggest things I think it does for minorities specifically in a maybe a toxic environment or a racist environment is that it reminds you that God is in control, that he created you. He's the one who gives you life. He's the one who gives you wealth. He's the one who, you know, can stop harm from coming to you. Or if harm is going to come to you, you know, only being that you can rely on is him to get rid of it. It's not that it's coming from the white man or this man or that man, or even like from my perspective, the Jews. It's really about you and your relationship with him. You know, there was a story from the slave period of a guy named Ibrahim Diallo, and I've mentioned this before on the podcast, but it's very important. He was brought as a slave to America, and he refused to work. He said, "I'm not working." And he was, you know, a Muslim, very strong Muslim. And his slave master wanted to beat him, but he couldn't. He couldn't bring himself to do it. He was so scared of him. He was so scared of his spiritual aura and presence. Right. So the slave master hired someone else to come beat him or even kill him. And that person couldn't even do it. And so what did they do? They ended up sending him back to Africa. Now you think about that and you think obviously all the other slaves had to suffer, but that is called personal reliance on the divine. Sure. And that's what Islam teaches us. So when you have that revolutionary understanding of how the world actually works with God at the center of it, then, you know, yeah, people may give you an askance look or say a negative word to you and things like that. But your relationship with the divine elevates you above all of that. You know, if anything, you almost want to pity that person for being stupid enough to think that that's, number one, hurtful to you, and number two, that they, you know, are better than you as a result of what they said. It's almost like, you know, you feel sad for someone. It's almost like someone who's eating like, you know, vomit, and you're watching them and you're like, man, I feel bad for him eating vomit, and he's like, you know, gobbling it up as if it's something, you know, spectacular.
It empowers you. You know, it gives you that spiritual awareness that we need.
Yeah.
And I'm going back to the early 1920s. Once Noble Drew Ali started teaching Islam here in this Western Hemisphere, the people became so emboldened that they almost became arrogant. And Drew Ali had to issue a proclamation, and on this proclamation on January the 15th, 1929, which happened to be the day that Dr. King was born, he issued a proclamation saying, stop flashing your nationality cards, meaning stop being so bold with it, just speak in an intelligent tone. But the words he spoke that day were the spirit that was coming into the world through Dr. King, who carried on that same work to a large extent. Mm-hmm. But it was on the point of nonviolence. Okay, he took his pattern from Gandhi, but you have to be strong in order to stand up and take that abuse.
Yeah.
Our generation was the one looking at our mothers and fathers being mistreated and saying, well, we're not going to take that. You're not going to tell me I have to go drink out of water hose and you drinking out this faucet. You're not going to tell me that I have to bow my head when I talk to you and not look in your eyes. Well, see, that's what was ingrained in the youth of the 60s. We're just not going to take this. We're going to organize. We're going to resist. We're going to resist. And you saw the H. Rap Browns. You saw the Jeff Fords. You saw the Fred Hamptons. You saw the Bobby Seals. You saw the Huey Newtons. You saw the spirit. There were people that were proud of who they were. And they had to stop it. I mean, it's no secret. I mean, it's documented. J. Edgar Hoover said we got to stop the rise
of a black Messiah. Yes, right.
Okay. So what is he going to do? We're going to get rid of all of them. Every one of them that we can. We're going to, the ones that we know we can murder, we're going to murder.
Well, you're going to assassinate them to set an example.
That's right. The ones that we don't feel like we're going to kill because his people may react in another violent way, we're going to incarcerate them. For the other ones, we're going to give them some money and buy them off.
Yeah.
But through all the tactics that they use, it slowed it down, but it didn't kill it. Because now that same spirit of rebellion is in a generation now without leadership. And it spilled over into becoming violent.
Right, because it becomes like a fratricide or like cannibalism.
Like a wildfire burning.
Yeah.
So, there's got to be some control now.
Yeah, we just got to be direct all that energy is really what it is. And as some people may know, we're doing something in 45th and State. We're AMC Center. We're going to be doing a lot of stuff there. Right. But again, interfacing with other Muslim groups, other groups in the community, and helping people understand. I think the knowledge gap. I think that's one of the bigger factors. But I know you have other engagements, so I really appreciate you coming on today. And definitely, I feel like in the future, God willing, we should definitely do it again. Inshallah. Thank you again, Brother Floyd.
Yes, sir. Thank you.